Hi, everyone. I'm Amanda Jor, and I work with Strength Counseling Services. We are running a stories series, and today we have Rosa with us. So I'll hand it over to Rosa. If you can introduce yourself and then tell us your story.
Right. Thanks, Amanda. Hello, everyone. My name is Rosa Toste. I am a clinician here with Strength Counseling Services and thought I would provide you all with a glimpse into what mental health services have done for me or impacted my life in a positive way. As many people in this world, we all come from different backgrounds, experiences, cultures. So from a very young age, unfortunately, I was exposed to a lot of, we'll call it trauma. And so went out in the big bad world and thought, you know what? I survived that. I can survive the world. What I came to recognize over time was that I couldn't do it alone. And as I'm sure people have heard the saying, it takes a village. It does. And usually that village will consist of some mental health practitioners, family, friends, collective family, chosen family, as some of us will call it, are also a positive reinforcement in change. So I went out in the world, to be frank, and didn't trust therapists. Had some experiences that are what we would call something out of the movies of just not feeling like I was heard, feeling like I was a burden. And I started my therapy journey when I was about, well, I did when I was really little, but probably around 16. And at 16, I still was very much identifying with my survivalist attitude. So didn't really trust that anyone could help me. And then I stayed out of therapy and thought, nah, I can do this on my own. And so there was a lot of suffering that happened as I reflect back because I was just trying to do what I knew best, which was to survive. When I hit my mid 20s, I get to age myself in this process. So this is delightful. When I hit my mid 20s, I started recognizing that there was a lot of repetitive patterns and I just felt a lot of shame about them. And the people that I surrounded myself with reinforced that shame. So I decided at that point, okay, maybe there's more to this counseling thing. I think I'll try again. I feel really fortunate because I had access to sliding scale program that allowed me to afford therapy because one of the barriers that or I'm going to call them excuses that I used was, well, I can't trust them. But then it was, well, then I can't afford it. And those are legitimate things, but I know that I used them as barriers to ask for help because I spent so long doing it on my own. So I found this counselor and I remember being in there and she was like, "Tell me about you." And I was like, "Why?" And I recognized that I went into it suspiciously. And I said to her, "Why are you asking me so many questions?" And she's like, "Why are you so defensive?" And I was like, "Why are you calling me defensive?" So it was like a little bit of a back and forth banter. But what I realized was that she was mirroring to me what I was bringing in there. And I recognized it like in a moment. And I was like, okay. I'm like, maybe we can try this again. She's like, okay. And the really neat thing was that this person showed up there, wasn't like in the way that I'm describing it, she wasn't like argumentative or antagonistic. She was just like, I could see that she was trying to match my energy somehow. And it worked for me because it put a mirror to myself and it made me realize, oh, why am I being so defensive? And so I told her and I said, I have a really hard time trusting people in general. And I said, especially professionals. I said, because as a child, I didn't have that and I didn't feel like anyone was there to help me. So I just survived. And I think that was really helpful in being able to pull back these defensive layers I had around allowing help. And that was my first dive into an experience with therapy where she helped me realize that I wasn't just a messed up person. I just had these coping mechanisms that helped me survive and get through life. But I just got to a place where the things that used to help me survive were now keeping me stuck. And at that point, I delved into the world of boundaries and learning about codependency and learning about dysfunctional family systems and addiction and the impacts of that and mental health. And so it really opened my mind to recognizing that there was hope in getting help. And so I spent about 10 years with that one clinician, and she saw me through two breakups and me having to set healthy boundaries with a family member and take space from that. I remember one thing she said to me was, Rosa, you don't need my permission to make decisions. And I was, of course, appropriately defensive because I was like, I'm not asking you. And then I thought about it for a sec and I said, oh, I am though, because I'm scared I might mess it up. And so she was super helpful because and it brings up emotion now because as I said before, like often if I felt shame or I expressed shame and people didn't really recognize that, I find that it would worsen, it almost solidify like, oh, I should feel ashamed. Where having experienced someone who I considered unbiased, this wasn't my friend, this wasn't family, it helped me land. And even though I wanted to run or sabotage it, she held really tender space for that. And that journey really took me into building confidence in myself and the decisions I made. And even if I did make a mistake, I could still learn from it and I could still grow from it rather than feeling that I just needed to be punished or have consequences. So yeah, so when I went to find a new therapist, and the reason I was looking for a new therapist is because mine moved away and the online thing wasn't really too popular yet. I realized, and maybe some people can relate to this, like finding a new therapist is like trying to find a new hairdresser. It feels wrong. there's, there's some sense of loyalty of working with people where you're like, I don't know. And then the bar feels really high because it's like, oh, I'm looking for empathy. I'm looking for warmth. I'm looking for a non judgmental space to be able to share my fears and things I feel embarrassed with, and someone to hold space in that and help me grow from it rather than hide from it. And then another significant experience I had throughout my journey with therapy is like I'm in recovery for an eating disorder, and I also am in recovery around codependency stuff. And so I've had a lot of support around building skills and awareness. I didn't get help with my eating disorder for a long time because I felt a lot of shame around it. I felt like I could just do it on my own. I'm sure people can relate to that. And I thought it was just something broken in me. And then realizing it wasn't was really eye opening. But a really interesting thing that happened in my life was that I was so focused on interpersonally, well, no, personally speaking, focused on wanting to build healthy relationships with people that I didn't realize that the codependency was leaking into my professional life. And so I came upon a situation in my life where I had to make some decisions around leaving a workplace that was no longer serving me in a well way. And I had another therapist who flat out said to me, this might be time to exit. It might be time to take some space to detangle myself from how enmeshed I was with this place I worked at. And that was really profound because I thought separated it. I thought when I'd hear people be like, you're so confident, you're so great. Yes, I am. I felt sort of untouchable on the professional sense because mentally I was like, no one's ever done to me what my family did to me. So I can handle this. But, growing up in a dysfunctional family system, there's a lot I tolerated. And so rather than be like, red flag, can't have that, I was like, oh, maybe that's orange. Maybe that's not actually red. And I would negotiate red flags that I would see in my workplace. And so it was profound to have someone there encouraging me, not just my therapist, but my family doctor. My family doctor, who I still have, is really a huge advocate for mental health. And I felt really held and supported in that process. and my friends and some of my colleagues as well were really encouraging and gentle with me, but also honest. And I got to say that throughout my experience of being therapized, I recognized that's what I wanted to do in the world. I said, I want to be a therapist. I want to be someone that like says it how it is and doesn't dance around things and isn't scared to tell me how it should be or what it could be. Granted, I've had to adjust myself in some ways because no cookie cutter way of helping one person. There's so many different ways to support people. It was neat because I think because of my own experience of getting support, I recognized that was something I wanted to be able to do in the world was to show up as healthily as possible and as honest as possible and be able to show people that like we can get well and we will get well. And this striving for perfection thing has, in my lifetime, almost killed me a few times. And so, really dropping into that acceptance of I'm not perfect and that's okay is a journey, certainly not a destination. So, I appreciate how much I've evolved in my relationship to having therapists because it keeps me honest and it keeps me consistent. When I think of really big life changes that I've had, I'm feel very thankful after that first 10-year stint with my first therapist because I don't make decisions blindly. I'm a firm believer that I want to be informed and understand if I'm showing up for me, if I'm showing up for others, and what I need to do to be able to stay in my lane, so to speak. And having a therapist, having a family doctor who advocates for mental health, having my collective chosen family. These are all people in my village and that have allowed me to continue to look at how to show up in this world as honestly as possible. I had a situation where one of my parents got sick and I think I went into shock. I'm going to call it shock. And right away went in, I'm good, I'm fine. I just need to focus on this person and help them. And I remember my therapist at the time was like, "Oh, can you define to me what fine and good looks like?" I was like, "Well, I'm working, I'm eating, exercising, I'm doing the things." And she said, "Yeah, but how are you feeling with things?" I was like, "What?" I was like, "What do you mean? I'm here. I'm," and she'd say, "How are you feeling?" And I'd be like, "Well, and I'd talk about my parent and their status. And my therapist would be like, "Yeah, but how are you feeling?" I'm like, "I'm telling you how I'm feeling." So that was something that really stuck to me where I realized that a lot of how I showed up in the world was based on how other people were being impacted or how they were impacting me, but wasn't about my own experience. So I think that when I think about the benefits of therapy and even being a clinician now, I often like to remind people like we all have our unconscious defenses and that's okay. And rapport and warmth and positive regard, all those things are really important. We have to give it a chance though. And I realized that for me, that's what I needed to do. I did have an experience where I had a clinician leave work with me in the middle of processing trauma. And that was really tough because I thought, this is interesting. I've always seen therapists as people that were there to help me and not hinder my process. And the really cool thing is that because I'm connected and I do have people in my life that I can ask for help from, I was able to find a therapist who was able to hold that space for me and help me process what it felt like in my mind, what it felt like to be abandoned. And I think that if I didn't have as much experience as I had being a client, a situation like that, and I'm sure people can relate to this, would probably just be like, yeah, no, this isn't for me, or no, never again. I've said those things. And I remember experiencing that. And again, going into shock, being like, is this real life? Is this really happening? But realizing, oh, I need help. And I think that's one of the benefits that I've gained over my experience of being a client is that I can recognize when I need help and I can ask for help. And those were skills that I just didn't think were options for me in surviving. So I think that, like, when it comes down to does it help? Like, I often will get that question from people. I'll get that from like friends. Does it help? And it's, well, for me, if I'm left to my own devices and I can convince myself it's a really good idea, it helps to check something out with someone, be like, and I remember my first therapist being like, Rosa, you don't need my permission. So I find sometimes I say that even to my therapist, I'm not looking for permission. What I'm looking for is support. And that has been really encouraging because I've had therapists be like, I'll support you in what you feel you need to do in this. And I'm like, oh no, pressure. This is a lot of responsibility. So I'm almost immediately going to dread. I'm like, oh, I've said the thing out loud. Now I'm going to fall. Am I going to fall through? And then all my intrusive thoughts will come in and be like, do it, abandon it, sabotage it, get out of it. But again, because I've had consistent positive experiences with therapy, I can identify those things. I can even say them out loud and be like, I'm having this thought. And to have a person be like, okay, let's see where that thought is, why it's there, and where we need to take it, and how do we put it to rest. So it has been like, I feel like I have lived my life consistently in it's a journey, not a destination. But I gotta say, I get impatient. I want to know what the end's gonna look like. And then I'm like, what is the end? Is it death? Because looking for these outcomes, it's so hard, I think, to just wait and see. I think the difference now is that I don't wait and see with my arms crossed and do nothing. I do things. I take care of myself. I do mindfulness and I work out and I nourish myself and I participate in a talking circle weekly with a few close friends where we get to talk about how we feel and what's going on. And it's a beautiful, non judgmental space. I don't know that I would have ever imagined being part of a talking circle that's not a group therapy setting where it's being facilitated by a clinician. Like, it's really quite beautiful, the gifts that come out of not just therapy, but like how we evolve as a result of therapy. And yeah, I recognize that, like, no matter how great I could be doing in one area of my life, something's bound to come up. But now I feel like I've got the most important skill for me is that I can ask for help. It's not even so much about, okay, what's the solution here? What do I need to do? It's more like, all right, I need to I gotta call in my resources and get things, I guess, organized so that I can feel like I have a direction and it's an informed direction. And I guess my point of bringing up life on life's terms is that, and sometimes I'll hear this from people, they're like, why does all this have to come at once? And I'm like, well, if we're caring for ourselves, and I remember that for me, if I'm caring for myself, then even though things are upsetting or hurtful, or I can handle it. Whereas before I felt like I was like running on fumes. I wasn't caring for myself well. And so any inconvenience or incident that would come into my life, I did not have the capacity to deal with. So it felt like way more heightened. Whereas specifically in the last year, I have quite often said, if I wasn't working out, eating well, connecting with my friends, finding ways to ground myself, I'm like, I would handle this poorly. Like, I could reflect on that now and do that and be like, oh, yeah, old me. Oh, I would have lit this on fire a long time ago. Whereas now, when I catch myself doing it, it's almost like Gollum from Lord of the Rings. I'm probably going to try to start a fire, but I will catch myself doing that and I will ask for help. But is there still like a little like niggling memory part of me that's like, do the bad thing? Or I don't know if there's those memes with Kermit the Frog and he's wearing this like black cloak and he's like, do the thing that you're not supposed to do the bad thing. Sometimes I get that vision and I'm like, no, no, I know I can do that thing. I know I always have choices, but what has helped me, honestly, apart from asking for help, is practicing honesty and being able to, and how I've been able to do that is because I've had mental health support where I've been held and not judged, not told what I was doing or what I was feeling. I was just held. And I think that was uncomfortable. No, I know it was uncomfortable in the beginning because I didn't know what to do with silence. I wanted to fill the silence with chaos, to be frank. Whereas now I really can be in the silent and it feels peaceful. Sometimes it feels lonely, but those are things that I know I can manage now because I have the skills, and I have the skills because I let people help me. And yeah, and so I feel for me, and sometimes I get clients that come in and say, I've got nothing bad to talk about. And I'm like, then we're going to celebrate the good. And I think that's a really important part of mental health services is recognizing that mental health support isn't just when we're in crisis. It's also to have people witness us on our journey to be like, I did this thing. I'm feeling well about this thing. And I have that experience with my own therapist where it's like, oh, these things are going well. And then Kermit the Frog's in there going, something's going to mess up. So then I just say the thing out loud, like, oh, part of me though that's waiting for something chaotic. And I think having that awareness and having that support to unpack that and just not let it take over has been a huge help in my world. And yeah, and so the journey and destination aspect, like I hope that I will always be in therapy because it actually is a part of my identity. That's the healing, healthy part of me. And I know that accessing therapy for me hasn't only been because I'm in crisis or because I'm struggling, but it's also because I want someone unbiased to witness my journey and be able to hold that for me. It's a very different space than the space that a friend holds or a family member or a coworker. It is a really special relationship, but it's one that isn't cultivated overnight. And a big lesson for me in life so far in my relationship with therapy has been that after my family system, I went out in the world and I just wung it. I was like, all right, who's going to be my friend? Who's going to be my lover? And I would force myself and force people into these roles unconsciously because I thought that's what I was supposed to do. But I've learned to grow up in my process of asking for help and recognizing I can take my time. I can decide who I want in my life and how I want them in my life. And I learned to do that through asking for help. So, yeah, I mean, I don't know what else. I don't know what else to offer. I think
That's brilliant. I love everything that you've said, and you've been just such a like beautiful asset to my life and this company. And you've been here a long time now, and it's just been so cool to. It's cool is an understatement, but it's so cool to work with you and grow with you. I think that we both have grown a lot together in this process in the last. I think it's been like 5 years now or
going,
so. Isn't that nuts? It's amazing, and I'm really moved also by, and I always have been, Rosa, by your ability and just to put yourself out there and be vulnerable. And you're just like, this is who I am and take it or leave it. Right. And this is what I have to offer. And that's the way it is. And I think that who you are and how you put that into the world is just such a beautiful thing and so important for people to see. And so I'm really thankful that you were willing to do this story submission here for the world to see you. Right. And to see what you stand for and what you believe in. And it's not even, okay, I'm a therapist and this is what I do with my clients. It's congruent with how you live your life. And that genuineness is so important for people to see because I think that there's a lot of people out there who have no idea how to live from that authentically genuine place because it can be very scary, as you mentioned. So I'm just curious, we have a bit of time left. I'm curious about, we talked a lot about therapy and how that's really helped and continues to help over the years. But I'm wondering how therapy has contributed to you becoming more your authentic self and the resilience that you've brought to your life and the strength that you have in how you live your life and how you make your decisions. Because asking for help is one thing, but then actually incorporating and taking in the help and doing something about it is another thing. Because I do think that everybody has this essential self that knows what it needs, but we have to figure that out. So it's like we have to like tap into the essential self to understand it. And asking for help is an excellent way of figuring that out. So, in your own way, how have you gotten to this place of really befriending your essential self, living from that place, and how has counseling helped you to do that?
In 500 words or less. No. Well, I mean, that's a it's not only a big question, but it's a big experience, and I feel like it is for me, a never-ending process. I like to, like, remind people, not just clients, but, like, friends and even myself, this isn't a lack of having answers. It's for me, it's been a lack of believing in myself, and what's interesting about that is even over time, when I think about times where I've been like, "Help me," I would still go do what I wanted, and it would not necessarily be aligned with what was suggested. And then I'd go back and be like, so I did the thing that probably shouldn't have done. And now I realize it doesn't work. So now I need to apply. So I think there's like a trial and error aspect, to be frank, about putting things into practice because I know that ego for me has gotten in the way of it's not even just the asking for help, but like taking the help because they're still have this again survivalist attitude of I'm just going to do it my way. And so I think a valuable thing for me that's helped me build this resilience is actually listening, not just hearing what a person is saying and then going off and doing whatever, but like learning to trust what I'm hearing. That has been a really important part of me being able to feel resilient and to be proud of that. I think that when I was younger, there's memes out there too that talk about, oh, you're such an old spirit, an old soul. And it's like, oh, thanks. It's all the trauma. And I remember that when people would tell me I was so resilient, I would get upset because I thought, resilient? How was I didn't choose that. I didn't choose to have to survive that. I felt a lot of hurt and anger, but I think it's because I realized that resilience wasn't just a product of surviving anymore. I think resilience for me has been showing up for myself and having hope for myself. And even if I make a mistake, to be like, okay, I made this mistake. What can I do with it? How can I grow from this? So I do think, and again, I'm not sure if I'm directly answering what you said, but that's okay. I do believe that like resilience for me takes trust, but it's also now recognizing this that resilience for me is a badge I wear with pride. Whereas before I thought was just a result of, and I thought it was a thing I did because I had to. But I recognize that there's been so many times in my life now that I've had to be resilient. And I'm so thankful for that. Because then when you're talking about the congruency piece, one of the things that I really love and cherish about the being a clinician is that I don't ever think my work is done. I think that there's a lot that I still have to learn, and I do learn, and I'm open to learning. I think that when clients come and say, help, or let's sort this out, there's tons I get to learn about what they know that maybe I don't. And I actually take a lot of pride in not knowing everything. I feel like that's not only an impossibility, but that's a lot of pressure. I don't want to know all the things. But if there isn't something I know, I can ask for help. And I can say proudly, I don't know this, but let me look into it. That I can do. And I think that has been really helpful in building trust with people to recognize that I say what I mean. Anyway, yeah, I don't know if that really answered everything.
Fantastic. Yeah.
Okay.
And
Okay.
and whether it answered it or not, it doesn't matter.
Yeah, that's what I
It's
said
like
anyway.
this is
So
like this is you and it's real and I love it. I'm
yeah.
wondering about the difference between like bitter and not bitter in your life. What has helped you? What aspects of everything you've talked about have been really influential in helping you either not be bitter about all the things that have happened to you and all the trials you've gone through, or to overcome bitterness to be where I see you as today? And when I think about bitterness, I mean, like some people, they really let it eat them away. And then they can fall into depression and they have all these symptoms and they don't function well and they can't go to work. They can't get out of bed and things like that. And they just have so much hate and anger and anguish. And I think that a lot of us, or most of us, have been in that place at some point in our lives. And I'm really curious how you have come out of those places, if that's happened to you, and how you've modified your mindset from what has happened to you that wasn't fair that happened to you.
Mm. What a wonderful question. Right away, what came in my mind when you were saying that was mom issues. I grew up in a system where people identified with their bitterness and expressed it onto my generation. I remember quite young being like, is this what life's about? Like, really young, probably 6 or 7 years old, and being like, is this what life's about? And what I was referring to was the bitterness, the judgment, the suspicion. I realized that I was born into how do I say this? I was born into a system of hurt, system that showed me this is what it looks like if you identify this way. And I remember always feeling like a light, even though I wasn't celebrated as one until I got older. And then it continues to reaffirm now that my lightness is beautiful. I have my darkness too, but my darkness no longer runs the show. That's the thing about bitterness for me, resentment, all these unresolved hurts. I can hold on to them. I can let them make decisions for me, but are they truly the decisions I want? Am I doing things to move myself in a path of wellness or in a path of illness? I say this stuff to my clients, but I say it because like I have seen it for myself. I've seen what happens if I choose to allow my hurt to navigate my life. There's been in the last year things that I have done that I've allowed hurt to navigate and then went, ooh, I like to call it the hand on the burner. I'm like, I put my hand on the burner for too long. But I think with self compassion, which has been a big part of my journey, and self awareness, I can look at those things and realize that they are a part of my history, but they're not a part of my character. And that's why therapy was valuable for me because it helped me understand that there are things that happened to me and there are things that I did to survive, but they are not what encompass who I am. And so that light that I'm talking about, like I always knew I had this light about me and I would hear it from people too. But when you experience so much pain and hurt over time, it can be hard to be hopeful. It can be hard to see that light. But as I said, when we surround ourselves with chosen people, professionals, that's why they're there. They're there to make sure that light doesn't go out. Yeah. I have a lot of gratitude for shifting my attitude around bitter. But when I said mom issues is because when you said bitter, I'm like, oh, that sounds like my mother. And then I remember spending a lot of my life being like, I'll never be like my mother. And then I was like my mother. And then I was like, oh dear. So what is it that I don't like about being like my mother? And I realized that my mom, bless her, had a lot of unresolved stuff that she just carried in the world and unfortunately carried on to her children. And I realized that's not the imprint or the imprint that I want to make in this world. I want to be able to see people and people see me and go, look at that person and not look at me and go, look how much they've survived. I don't want to be known for surviving. I want to be known for thriving. So I have a lot of gratitude for the way I show up in the world now and in the work I do because the work I do keeps me aligned with wanting to be a person who shows up in vulnerability and in compassion and in mess too. We all have it. I like to joke. I know this is hard to believe, but I am quite funny. But I like to joke and say that oftentimes, like for me anyway, I didn't become a therapist because I got all of my stuff together to be able to show that to people. What I wanted to show to people was this journey of look at all the things that can improve. And then there's the things that take time. And then there are things that we have to learn forgiveness and compassion around. But there's no end. There's no end to the process of healing. It's continual. So I feel like I'm a representative of that. I feel like I am representing myself in a way that says, look at how I'm living and learning to move away from that identity of look how much I survived. It's just not, it doesn't fit for me anymore. So yeah.
Love it. Thanks, Rosa. If you had someone who was chatting with you and they said, I'm not interested in therapy, I can figure this out myself, or I have these other vices that I use. I go to the gym, I drink alcohol, and I'm fine. But it's obvious that they're not actually doing very well or functioning well in their life. What would you say to them?
I've had this experience personally and professionally. Trust and respect are two things that are not assumed. They're not given, they're earned. And when I've had experiences like this, what I try to put light to is like asking them, tell me about these things. When did these things start? Tell me about the pride you have around these things. I think that oftentimes for myself anyway, and I've seen it in people, it's like, I want to say it's easier to show up in defensiveness because we've had to protect ourselves. But I think back to the experience I had of someone gently mirroring to me what was happening. And that happens with time. But often when someone says, I don't need this, I'm like, cool, what do you got? Show me that. Walk me in a day in the life. And then in that, especially when someone says fine, I like to say to clients when I start, and I'm sure if my clients ever heard this, this would stick. I often like to say to people that we have a tendency to give people descriptors when we say, how are you? Oh, good, fine, okay, not bad, living the dream. These are all descriptors. And so I encourage people to be like, let's peek under that because I socially will use that. If I don't want to tell someone how I'm feeling, I'm like, good. Well, what I've actually started to do is if I don't feel well, I will say I'm not good, but I don't want to talk about it. Or sometimes it doesn't even go there. Sometimes people are like, what's going on? And I'm like, nah, I don't want to talk about it. I can do that. But I feel like that for me is more congruent to show up and be honest about that rather than be like, I'm fine. So when someone says they're fine, I'll explore fine, not just the acronym of fine, which I will not say here, but I will explore like, what does fine mean? Is fine good? Is fine something that you've been wanting to achieve? And just understand the person, understand what is it they're saying, what they're not saying. And I think that's, when I think about emotional intelligence, I always think of emotional flexibility. If we don't have the language, how do we know that we're able to do or say or feel a thing? We don't. So we learn. So I often see when someone comes with resistance, I am curious to friend that resistance because there's a lot there to learn about. So that might be bad news for the people that are like, I'm just going to totally resist with Rosa. Perfectly fine. But please know that resistance to me isn't rejection. To me, it's always something to be curious about. So I don't know if that's like a typical therapist response, but curiosity is a very beautiful thing if we allow it.
I agree. And I really think that every experience that we have in our life can be seen as information, right? Whether we're enjoying the experience or we're having a lot of trouble in the experience or we're hating the experience or being resistant or fighting or I think there's just tons of information there. And so I love the curiosity piece because then we can walk together and learn about what's underneath. And a lot of times it's hard to do that on your own when you have all these muddled up thoughts and all these feelings going on at the same time. And so I really agree that even if we're not asking for help, just like checking it out. You said that earlier, right? And just saying, hey, let's just look at this. And if you don't think you need help, then that's okay. But it might be great to just check it out because I think that a lot of times there's this like niggly little voice inside that goes, I don't know if I like that, or I think I might need this, or it's guiding us in some way. People call that intuition. I'm sure there's other names for it, but the niggly voice will tell us. And I think if we listen to it, it's just incredible what we might find. Because when you were 16 and you were like, therapy? No, there was something that shifted you into your willingness to do this? And I'm curious for you, was it that little voice or like, what was it that where you were like, okay, like, let's go?
Honestly, I think that I was tired of suffering. I actually had a really interesting exchange back in December with someone I reconnected who I hadn't talked to since we were 18 years old. And I know, being 19 now, that's a joke. It was it was a long time ago, over 20 years ago. And I was talking about how big changes had happened and I had to switch counselors and was getting support around containing some of what I was processing. And I said, because I want to heal, I want to continue to do better and be better. And this person said to me, "Oh, but you were all about your trauma when we were kids." And I said, "What?" I said, "What do you mean?" And they said, "You were always like, I survived this, never again." Like, they were like, you were just like, you had this conviction about you where you're like, never again. And they're like, and now you're saying that you're processing this trauma. And I thought that was an interesting thing to hear from someone who knew me at 18 years old. And I said to them, "Oh," I said, "that was my identity. I wanted to tell people how much I survived, but I didn't know that I could actually do anything about it." So I thought that was quite an awareness for me and realizing like years now, I've been like, okay, actually, when I had that therapist for 10 years, I remember, and I don't know if people have this thought, but I feel like people do. I was like, okay, how do I do this? I remember before going in, do I tell them like my life story? Do I sit there and be like, it all started here? Like I didn't like, no, I'm like, how's this person going to help me if they don't know all the things? And what I come to realize is that what I show up with today will give them hints about stuff from my past. So that's been really helpful because when I realize now is that not one therapist knows my whole life story and they don't need to. They just need to know what it is that I'm going to bring today. And yes, there'll be references and there will be points where we need to go some places, but we go because I'm willing and not because they want to. So yeah. All right. I felt like I went on a tangent, but I really liked it.
Love
So
it. I love your tangents. So fantastic. So this is great. And I know we're almost at time. So I just want to thank you for putting yourself out there. And my hope and our hope as an agency is that we can reach people who are not sure what to do and they're feeling alone, they're struggling, they feel like nobody understands them. And at the same time, they may not want to ask for help for a variety of reasons. And so these videos and this whole series is really about saying, hey, you, if you relate to anything being said here, let us know
yeah.
because you don't even have to ask for help. We can just say, let's check it out
Yeah.
and see what happens. And it takes a lot of courage to do something like that and to reach out. And Rosa, I think that you have been courageous your entire life. And doing this is courageous. And I think doing this is easier now for you than it was many
Oh
years
yeah.
ago. Right? You're
Yeah.
just such a natural at it. But I also want to thank you for your courageousness because without this, we can't reach others to say, hey, let's connect
Yeah.
because this stuff is important and it's life changing. We have people to say to us, clients will say to us, like, I never, if someone said to me in a year from now, you're going to be here and you're going to be feeling this and doing this, never would have believed them. And it's amazing change that can take place when you have the persistence, you have the
Mhm.
dedication, you have the drive, like you want this for yourself, that
Mhm.
suffering piece. I don't want to suffer anymore. And I think at the end of the day, let's just take one step and see how it feels. Right. So I'm really grateful for this time with you, Rosa. And whether it was being recorded or not, like this is just awesome to just sit and chat with
I
you.
think, what you were saying about reaching people, I think I often like to remind people the hardest thing you have to do is show up, which might seem wild because we've got all these stories, right? All these conditionings that show up and go, what do I show? What do I don't? Or what don't I show? And I think it's really like important to recognize like we don't need to have all the answers. We just need to show up. And the hope is that a person can have a connection because connections are important. Like building rapport is important. I recognize in my own journey, I felt bad that it was almost like I'm not winning at therapy because I didn't like a person I was working with. And I realized, oh, that's okay. Like I guess my hope for people is to recognize you don't have to have all the answers. You probably don't need all the solutions right away. Just show up because the rest will unfold. It will. It's inevitable, especially even if a person comes and says, I don't want to do this, it's, well, you're here. So, like you said, let's just peek around and see what's there. And if the person allows it, great. And if they don't, well, that's usually an indicator of let's really slow that down because maybe you're not in a place where you want me to check it out with you. That's okay. So I think that message is so important is to realize I'm not interested in having an agenda. I'm interested in hearing you and hearing what you have to share and working together to see what we can come up with that will provide tangible and satisfying solutions where a person can be like you were saying, where someone was like, this is life changing. Oh, yeah. And it's life ever changing. Like, it's oh, goodness. Well, I'm done here. Like, no, it's just, it'll open up doors that we don't realize. So taking chances really do work. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's amazing. Okay, I'm gonna hit stop and then we can just say goodbye.